Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for choosing Across the Fence. I'm Will Michael. The 4th of July gets all the attention when it comes to our nation's independence, and rightfully so. Our country's founders adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. It would take the American Revolutionary War and 11 more years for the United States Constitution to be written and ratified. And the ratification date was September 17th, 1787. September 17th is Constitution Day. It's a day to celebrate all those who are U.S. citizens, either by birth or naturalization. Now, to learn more about our historic document and how it's guided our country for more than 230 years, we're joined today by Professor Peter Teachout from Vermont Law School. Professor Teachout is internationally recognized for his expertise in constitutional law and history of the United States. Professor Teachout, good afternoon, and thank you very much for being with us.
Good afternoon, Will. Glad to be.
I think it's probably fair to say, you might disagree, but most of us have never read the Constitution, or if we did, it was in a high school civics class. What does the Constitution do?
Well, the Constitution does a number of things. Basically, it provides powers to the federal government. It establishes a Congress, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. It allocates powers between the federal government and the states. And it, as amended with the Bill of Rights, also protects important individual liberties. So that's basically what the Constitution does.
And so in laying out those branches of the federal government, the legislative and the executive and the judiciary, those branches then can only exercise powers that have been given to it by the Constitution. Is that correct?
That is correct. The traditional understanding is the Constitution is a document that provides enumerated or listed powers to the federal government. And the powers that are not granted to the federal government are retained by the states.
So where in the Constitution does the Congress, our federal House and Senate, where in the Constitution do they get their powers?
Well, that's interesting. After the summer of 1787, which was the summer of the Constitutional Convention, the convention established a committee on style, which basically was charged with taking all of the resolutions that were adopted and organizing them. So the powers of Congress are set forth in Article 1. We'll get to this, but the powers of the executive in Article 2 and judicial powers in Article 3. So that's the way the Constitution is organized. So the powers that the federal government exercises are primarily contained in Article 1 of the Constitution.
And those are significant. I don't know them all. I know you know them. We're talking about taxes. We're talking about making money, establishing post office, very specific things that the Constitution gives Congress authority to do.
That is correct. Article 1, Section 8 contains a laundry list of specific powers that were delegated by the states to this new federal government under the Constitution. That includes, as you said, the power to tax and spend for the general welfare. Before that, the federal government had no power to do that. It also includes the power to regulate commerce among the several states. And that was extremely important at the time because prior to that, the states engaged in little trade wars, imposing tariffs on goods from other states and retaliatory tariffs. So this importantly gave Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states. And that's proved to be the source, the primary source for the exercise of federal power ever since.
So how far do the powers of Congress extend? And the basis of that question gets to the idea that the courts step in when there's a difference of opinion. Is that correct? So again, how far do the powers of Congress extend?
Well, after the Great Depression and the creation of the so-called New Deal Court, a court that was sympathetic to the New Deal program instituted by FDR. The court basically read the commerce power very broadly, allowing Congress to pass any law and adopt and implement any law that had any impact on the national economy. So you can imagine there's very little of our daily lives that is not therefore potentially subject to federal regulatory control. In the late 1930s, the court said that Congress had the power to regulate what a small farmer in the middle of some Midwestern state could grow and produce for his own crops because it had an impact on the price of the price stability for wheat. So very extensive powers under the Commerce Clause.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago, okay, so Congress, Article 1, the powers of the presidency, I think you mentioned Article 2. So what does the Constitution say about the powers of the presidency?
Well, it's really interesting. While there's a specific laundry list of powers that Congress can exercise, Article 2 is sort of like a bare cupboard. There are very little specific powers. The president is given the power to execute the law. And the understanding is Congress would adopt laws and the president only had the power to execute or administer the laws that Congress adopted. The president is also given the power as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So, but you read through Article 2 and you find very little there beyond that. He does have the power to make certain appointments, often only with the consent of and approval of Congress. So very limited powers on the part of the executive. There's one other exception. Basically the president can only implement laws that have been adopted by Congress. But if Congress authorizes the president to act, then that congressional authorization serves as a basis for allowing the president to act in a wide range of circumstances.
Professor, does the Constitution mention executive orders that can be issued by a president? I think many of us are familiar, specifically over the last 2 administrations, of the number of executive orders. That really didn't exist prior to Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. So where is in the Constitution does it talk about a president's ability to issue executive orders?
Well, that is interesting. There's no specific mention, even contemplation, of the president issuing executive orders in the constitutional document itself. But if Congress says, look, here's a law, for example, the Occupational Safety and Health Law, you are authorized to adopt regulations regulating safety and health in our industries in this country. And then the president is given authorization, not by the Constitution to issue executive orders, but given authorization by a congressional act. That's where the source of executive power originates.
Well, thank you for filling us in on that. I know that a lot of people are curious about that. We know that many of the rights and liberties that we value as Americans, the freedom of speech, religion, due process of law, they were not part of the original Constitution. They were included in the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. Why wasn't the Bill of Rights included during the original ratification of the Constitution?
Well, it's interesting. I think there were 2 factors that played into that. One is that Congress really and the federal government is given no general regulatory power, certainly given no criminal law enforcement power under the Constitution. So there was some sense that since the federal government wouldn't have extensive powers, might regulate commerce, wouldn't adopt general criminal laws or enforce general criminal laws, you really didn't need a Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution. But the other reason was they just didn't get to it. And they didn't get to it in part because all of the states had their own state constitutions at that point in time. And the state constitutions had their own Bill of Rights. And since criminal law enforcement was primarily the responsibility of the states, the feeling was, hey, we don't need a Bill of Rights here because the federal government isn't going to be adopting laws that interfere with your personal life in the way that criminal law enforcement does.
You mentioned something interesting before we began the recording of today's program, and that is that there were actually representatives to the Constitutional Convention that opted not to vote for the Constitution because it did not include the Bill of Rights or a Bill of Rights.
That is true. And more importantly, we have to recognize that the document that came out of the Constitutional Convention did not become automatically ratified and effective. It had to be ratified by at least 9 states before it was to become effective. And so after the convention, this document was sent out to the states, to state ratifying conventions. And in a number of states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, there was serious objection to this proposed new constitution because people saw it as granting a federal government new powers, expanded powers, and yet there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So, for example, in New York, if 2 votes had changed out of maybe 300 delegates, the Constitution would not have been ratified. Massachusetts, if 10 votes out of more than 300 delegates had changed, we would have had no Constitution. So opposition to the proposed Constitution on grounds it didn't contain a Bill of Rights was a very strong element in these ratification conventions.
I must say at this point, a discussion of the Constitution does not fit well into a 15-minute program. We have about a minute left, and I know this last question takes longer than that, but if you could give us at least some insight about the amendments to the Constitution. They're all significant, but as you look at them today, are they all created equal? Isn't it fair to say that some of the amendments are more important than others?
Well, I would hate to have to vote, but I would say if I had to vote, I would say the most important amendments to the Constitution are the post-Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection of the law and due process of the law, 15th Amendment, which prohibits discrimination based on race or previous condition of servitude, and probably the 19th Amendment, which was subsequently ratified only in 1920, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender.
230 plus years, and it's a Constitution that remains a work in progress. Thanks to you, Professor Peter Teachout of Vermont Law School, for sharing some insights with us about Constitution Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that is our program for today. We know you have choices, so thanks for choosing us. I'm Will Michael, inviting you to join us back here each weekday afternoon for another visit across the fence.